Citizen 12 is brought to you by Complexify, a social purpose corporation founded to support you living in alignment with your conscience and discerning what that is. Find out more at complexify.org. complexiphy.org.
Hello, citizens. My name is Paige Hulsey.
And my name is Emily Bogen.
And this is episode 16 of the Citizen 12 podcast.
Citizen 12 is not a program or a health treatment, but an inclusive place. Common ground to share and learn. If you have not yet listened to episode 0, we invite you to do that. You'll get a good sense of what this show is about and hear our steps, which were inspired by Alcoholics Anonymous. And those can also be found through any of our sites.
A little more of a preface. This show, this content may stir stuff up for you. In some ways, that's part of the point, but also we acknowledge that this can be hard, uncomfortable, even disruptive. Please engage with us responsibly and don't be on your own with stuff. Be in touch if that's the right thing. We care about you. It's why we're making the show.
Our podcast is created in Seattle, Washington. We acknowledge this as Duwamish land and strive to honor the past, present, and future Indigenous lives here. Citizen 12 supports Duwamish tribal services by paying real rent. Find out more at realrentduwamish.org.
Today's episode is all about lying. In our most recent episode about injurious behaviors, we had set up today's episode about lying. And today, in part 1, we'll begin with some additions to the last episode. And then in part 2, we'll get into lying. Part 1, let's talk some about what came out of our last recording. I'm going to acknowledge, I had put it in the show notes from last episode that we really aren't trying to hide that these topics are, of course, still continuing to unfold even for us as we record the show. And I really felt like in last episode, you heard me kind of having a realization, maybe more than was audible in previous episodes. And that felt vulnerable, and we have talked a lot about, and a lot of our listeners have given feedback about how vulnerable this show is and have thanked us for making that space. And I'm just also acknowledging that it feels very vulnerable to share this openly as we continue to learn and grow. And we see that as part of the value of making this show. We hope it's appreciated and that it can keep contributing to others, trusting that it's okay to be where we are with things. We don't have to have all the answers already. The first thing that I think we really wanted to address from the last episode, that I don't know exactly if we missed this before, but that there are certainly some known factors that complicate the issue of understanding harm and damage. And one is having been actually harmed. So I don't think it's a secret that the founders of AA, who really, as we've said before, first packaged these spiritual principles into the 12 steps, they were, from what we know, white men of upper middle class economic background with educations and, some semblance of family security. And it doesn't look to me as though they were people who went through life unharmed, but the body of literature that they left behind really doesn't speak at all to having ever been actually hurt or harmed. And of course, it's a reality. So what to say about this? That's just not how it is for all of us. Many of us, I mean, it seems incomprehensible to me that any people haven't been harmed in their lives, but certainly some people are harmed more than others. And I'm thinking about environmental racism, I mean, it's like an endless list of factors that are harmful that affect some people and not others. And to ignore that is dangerous and irresponsible. And including that in analysis and discussion has been missing in a lot of my life.
Yeah, I think leaving that out of the equation when you're going over harm and trying to decide, what harm was done and then later perhaps what to do about it. But leaving harm done to you and yourself out of the equation, it doesn't sound smart. It doesn't sound logical or reasonable. It
hasn't felt right. It hasn't worked.
It causes it definitely has caused more harm.
Right.
Yeah.
And we're talking here about both interpersonal abuse and harm and damage and societal or systemic or environmental harm or damage. I will actually share that I think even going to college, which was something I didn't do until I was in my 30s, contributed to my ability to recognize the reality of harm that is done to some people and not done to others, the kind of the validity and reality of that I'm very grateful for. I studied public health, so we look a lot at social factors that either contribute to health or not, and those factors are just not at play for all people. They're at play for some people and not for others. That's just real. And to act otherwise is reckless and further damaging, like you just said.
And I think what we're asking here kind of is a lot when we're talking about having taken these steps from Alcoholics Anonymous. There is no mention of that, like harm done to you. In fact, like I believe Alcoholics Anonymous says we're not going to think about that. We're like specifically not going to address harm done to us. We're just going to talk about our own harm. What we're introducing here, it's not new by any means, but I think in this context with like 12-step guidelines and structure, it is new. And I think what we're trying to say is it's necessary and it's beneficial. For me, at least, I've seen someone go through this process. I've seen myself go through this process without being conscious of these dynamics, which are complex and not really benefiting. If not just kind of things becoming more clouded and abuse becoming even more, internalized. And then I've been part of this process with others and been able to offer them, consciousness of societal abuse and interpersonal abuse, and seen so much more make sense and so much more agency be found.
On the topic of interpersonal abuse, I have found a tool that some people are very intimately familiar with. It's commonly called the power and control wheel. It came from the Duluth model, and I'll put a link to the Duluth model and the power and control wheel in the show notes. Really, I wasn't raised with education or information about what constitutes personal or societal abuse. I don't know if many people are. I mean, it doesn't appear to be something we teach in elementary school. And I think it would have been useful for me to have that information when I was younger, and it wasn't something that I learned more about until I was older. And now it feels like a very critical working part of how I interact in the world, how I am useful to others, how I observe behavior around me and in my own behavior. I think that we've said this before, but it's likely that we may end up doing a show more specifically about abuse, where we may talk more about this. But to acknowledge the reality of harm seems like we can't, that's very important. So I didn't want to, I know we said it in the last show, but again, here we are saying harm is real and there are real factors, known factors, like having been harmed, that actually can make it harder to identify and understand harm. Another piece that seems really critical to say is that we agree, observe that there is widespread general confusion and reluctance to classify or identify things as harmful. It seems pervasive in the world, not just in our local communities or interpersonal relationships, but it seems to me like almost everywhere I look, I see this reluctance to say, yes, this is wrong or damaging or harmful. And now that I'm looking at our show notes, I guess there really is a place where I see the reality of confusion. Remember, we had made a joke about how maybe confusion was just like a shtick or an act.
Yeah.
And I see that I myself, and I feel like it was audible in our last episode, and I see it in the world, this lack of clarity around what is harmful, when is something harmful.
It's coming to mind for me. I had a conversation with someone the other day, like a sticky conversation, and I had said something and I was like, and they responded in a defensive way. So I said, did I offend you? And they said, I don't get offended.
Yeah.
Like that's just, and it was a man, it was a white male. And,
it happens with, I feel like I've had that happen with a million people.
But to say like that, to be in a place,
to take the position, I
don't get offended. Like what has to mean.
Well, what I hear there is I cannot be hurt, which is cuckoo. I hope that's not too bad of a term to use, but like that's not real. Nobody can't be hurt. And I think it's a really dangerous position to take, to like pretend that anybody, ourselves or others, can't be hurt.
Right. I mean, it's good awareness to have around abusive dynamics. To keep in mind if there's that defensiveness against the self being hurt, or like the unawareness of the self being able to be hurt, then that probably carries over to believing that other people can be hurt. Can't be hurt.
Right. And that's actually what I wanted to talk about in this bit, is that I see this confusion and reluctance to identify harm as both ways. I don't want to say something I've done to you is harmful, and I don't want to say that what you've done to me is harmful. It's not separate or distinct. It's not like we all seem to have this ready access to saying, oh yes, you lied to me. I mean, that was what we were talking about in the last show, right? Somebody lied to me and I really hadn't gotten to or acknowledged or made space to say that harmed me. And again, I said it before, and if you didn't listen to the previous episode, you may want to do that. I had said it wasn't like it deeply damaged me or had these big, long-lasting effects or anything, but that shouldn't matter. That's minimizing.
We don't need to
measure harm. That's not this game. That's not the game we're playing here, is to say how severe or not severe harm was. But the facility to say, yes, something is damaging or not, seems really important. Maybe even as I'm walking through this for the show, seems increasingly important.
Right. You don't need to say the degree to which, but you can say how might that have been harmful, and you decided that might have skewed my ability to see this person who lied to me accurately.
Right.
This is interesting because I find that the more that I've been able to uncover and face the harm that I've done, the more I walk around saying things like, that hurt my feelings.
Like, so yes, I join you that, well, I don't know if I would say it in those words, but that my ability to glimpse isn't the right word, but like categorize, acknowledge that something is harmful that I've done has for sure opened up my ability to acknowledge that the things that have harmed me, to stop kind of pretending about that or being as confused. So, and that really, I'm not, that's true all over my spiritual growth, is that just as I found increased true access to caring about others, my caring for myself was awakened. I don't see that it can actually work any other way. I don't see that it's real, that I can be loving to you and somehow not to me. If I'm being loving, I'm being loving. And maybe that's a bit of a rabbit hole for today.
Well, I think we've opened up a very, I think, insightful thing for now, and we can marinate in it.
So I want to include a couple of reasons why I see this confusion and reluctance to categorize things as harmful. Starting with that, as you were saying earlier, we just aren't in a practice. This isn't part of our spiritual tradition, is to assess other people's behavior at all. We have been invited to direct our attention to our own behavior, to kind of redirect our attention away from what it has legitimately been not useful, like obsessive or perseverative, like of course there's a reality to like stewing on or rehashing or, hunkering down into having been hurt. That's possible. Maybe, as a therapist, you could even kind of connect that to, there's a distinction between post-traumatic stress disorder and just post-traumatic stress. Like there's a reality to the consequences of trauma that aren't pathological. And then there can be like a maladaptive trajectory after trauma. So yes, like, and I think this is like the founders of AA, they were really focused on just that maladaptive trajectory, but no space was made in how we have been raised spiritually to acknowledge the kind of normal, healthy trajectory after harm and being hurt.
Right. Like, why not critically examine your own and others' behaviors at a point when you feel like you are like lucid enough to do so? It just makes sense.
Well, and it's part of what's happened for us. So even without it being a structured part of our spiritual tradition, if you don't mind me saying, Emily and I both have found ourselves being kind of invited by our consciences to recontextualize, assess, and analyze how we have been treated in our lives. Those aren't even the 2 points I wanted to get to, but the first big reason that I see for the confusion and reluctance is this whole like sentiment. Do you want to read it?
Because if I'm hurt, there's something wrong with me.
Right.
Victim blaming.
Which is victim blaming, which is, okay, bear with us for a moment, because for a lot of us, and I swear it probably wasn't that long ago that I wouldn't have been able to listen through this talk. This idea that if I'm hurt, I'm in the wrong, or I've done something wrong, I now see as actually very dangerous. I'm not saying that there can't be value in assessing my role in a dynamic, like a shared dynamic. And, my mind's kind of all over the place. Like there's this in interpersonal, again, there's this interpersonal layer, and then there's the societal layer. And I'm thinking about lead poisoning from water. And I don't really want to talk about Flint. I don't feel quite qualified to talk about Flint and the water supply. But the individual people who have without doubt been harmed by lead poisoning in their homes, I guess some of them might find value in like reflecting on how they've voted or something that sort of somewhere is remotely related to what happened with the water supply there. My sense is that that's totally the wrong direction or position to take about assessing the root of that harm that was caused. Like bonkers. Like I think that is dangerous and wrong and a waste of time. That the people who made the mistake, who did the wrong thing, who chose money over health for the people, that's where the burden for assessing the harm is. Well, check me out talking about it more than I'd planned to.
I think that's a great analogy in a way, or like meta example of an interpersonal dynamic with this stuff.
We hear evidence about these funny beliefs all over the place. The phrase "it takes two to tango" is a common one used to conflate the person who's been harmed with the person who's doing the harm as both responsible. And again, it's not that there isn't value. And I have done the work to reflect on the part I have played in the relationships and in scenarios where I've been hurt. But what didn't get attention or space for it was for me to say, you hurt me.
Right.
I have been hurt.
Well, it's insane. It's insanity. It's delusional. It's to not acknowledge
that.
To not be cognizant of the reality of power dynamics and how they're playing out in a relationship. And whether it's an interpersonal relationship or like a more meso system, sort of what Paige was talking about, relationship with like the environment.
What word did you just use?
Meso system.
I don't know what that is.
Like there's a microsystem and then there's like the exosystem, and the mesosystem is more like how we're connected to our environments. It's Bronfenbrenner theory. Bronfenbrenner. Anyways, yeah, I like.
Thank you.
It's I think sober to and lucid to see the reality of power dynamics and how we're working within them. And if we don't have an accurate awareness of that, it's like how are we really assessing our own harm and where it belongs in it?
Yep. And so from every level, I now feel like I can see why this doesn't work. This general attitude that if I've been hurt, there's something the matter with me. That's just clearly not the case. I feel like I could go into other examples, but they all line up the same way. And I feel like I continue to wake up to how pervasive that attitude is in different communities. And I personally have been in a number of communities over my lifetime that have included that message. Starting with that, my family, when I was really little, were Christian Scientists. And I don't have a lot to say about Christian Science, but I can say that one factor of it that I still see alive in my family, even though nobody has practiced Christian Science for decades in my family, is this difficulty assessing, well, even with physical illness. So there was a denial of physical illness, discomfort, pain, or injury, really because if I was hurt, the message was, it meant I wasn't right with God. Now, I have come to understand that flavor of an idea is in many spiritual traditions. I have even read about it called spiritual bypassing as a way of kind of sidestepping dealing with the realities of life, harm, danger, injury, illness, death. I guess I want our listeners to hear, I'm onto you, not you, because I don't think it's from you, but I'm onto this tactic.
Right.
And I'm not into it anymore. I'm not going to take this position that if I'm ill, if I have a health condition, that it's because I'm bad.
Right. I like that you're saying that, sort of like, I'm not going to do this anymore, because that's kind of, I think, the reality of where I'm at too. Like, no more. No more victim blaming. No more blaming myself
victim from where I'm hurt.
And no more, I mean, and it doesn't come down to other blaming as well, because when you're looking at power dynamics, for instance, if you're talking about just like, the ordinary abusive male-female dynamic, if you're thinking about an abusive male, for instance, someone who says something like, I don't get offended, the blame doesn't end on him. It ends on a patriarchal society that tells boys that they can't be hurt, like it's the end of this story, the end of this isn't to end without love or to end without compassion. It's like to get the full story, all of the facts.
Right. And I don't know if maybe I've said it before in the podcast, but this show is for self-determination. This is what deeply matters to me, is that we, each of us individually and as a collective, are empowered, have our basic needs met, have our needs met so that we can proceed in alignment with what seems right for ourselves. That requires escaping dynamics of power and control where possible. Again, I don't have all the answers about this, but I know that what matters to me is to personally be a person who is standing for our self-determination. That's very different than, this isn't about ending with blame or it's someone's fault. This is about like, Emily and I at least are coming together, standing together, saying, no, let's keep opening up the space to get outside of power and control so that we can proceed forward however is appropriate for us, for ourselves.
Right.
Each.
And we've talked about like how that kind of makes that, where that leaves us, disembodying ourselves, or if that's a word, from these systems. We've talked about how that makes us feel a little bit weird and not part of, or not, definitely disenfranchised from power systems that we used to feed from.
And feel protected by.
Yes. And so, like, you're not alone if this is also difficult for you, because or makes you feel small, because it makes me feel that way too.
That's another known disenfranchisement is another known tactic that's used by those with power and control that I still see that I'm only in recent years been waking up to, seeing where I've been disenfranchised, where I have disenfranchised others, where I'm still disenfranchised, where we are. So we've really been all over the place on this, and I'm not apologizing for that.
I feel like we've touched the points.
We've touched the points. Well, I want to include though that another common. Sorry, did you want to say something else about that? Oh, that another common incentive for being confused about harm is that if I say something is harmful, then I'll have to make amends. I'll have to make amends. So I think there are funny things about that sentence. One is I never have, quote unquote, have to do anything. Actually, my ex-wife told me she had a professor who used to say, you got to get born and get dead. And they said it a lot, like as a reminder. Anything else we're telling ourselves we have to do, it's made up. None of us have to do anything. And gosh, there's a lot of messaging in the world and in our own internal and external cues about stuff we have to do. I've said it before, I like being as accurately related to reality as possible. So telling myself I have to do things, that's not very accurate. So remembering that's just made up flat, like that's on its face made up, that I have to make amends.
And you talked about it when we talked about this earlier. You fleshed out that when you're going through the process of identifying the harm that you've done, mulling over how you're going to have to make amends later, or what you're going to have to do about it later, actually doesn't help.
It doesn't clear anything up.
No.
It actually adds to the confusion.
Right, like separating it, setting it aside.
Yes. Traditionally, when we take the 8th and 9th steps, I know, at least for myself, I have worked very hard to, when we're in 8, we stay in 8. We don't, mind trip onto 9, because of course that's going to jumble up the work that we're doing in 8. One more point before moving into talking about lying. We'd spoken about having access to all ways of being at any time. And it came up for me. I'm even going to share. It kind of came to me in my sleep. People say, oh, let me sleep on that. I always thought that was like a saying. I like sleep on things and things happen. Like ideas and thoughts and understanding does kind of get fleshed together for me. that in a way that I really appreciate and value. And this was a piece that kind of came to me while I was sleeping on it, was that I think it's really more that I see that it's useful to take the position that I have access to all ways of being at any time. Because there's still all of my experience that I have actually only ever had access to whatever degree of being that I've had access to. Like, let's say honesty. It looks to me that even like with my standing interest and commitment to being honest for decades, I've still had fluctuations and growth in my access to being honest. And fronting about it, like pretending, hasn't served me. Like, I don't have any spiritual guidance inviting me to pretend I can be more honest than I can be. It actually seems like it's okay for me to just have the honesty I actually have access to, or even being present, all kinds of ways of being. Of course, there's a reality to whatever degree I actually have access to. And I still think it's good to take the position that it's all available. Mm-hmm. And this also makes space for that there are, and we'll talk about this later, steps for me to take to increase my access. I actually see that as my responsibility, that I do what it takes to continue to expand my access to, like, being honest.
Yeah, I see that.
Well, we didn't mean to do this again like this, but I actually now see that this show, it makes sense to just end here rather than going on to talk about lying for today, because really, even though I thought we were going to do something like a different deal than usual, I now am realizing we did a show about injurious behaviors, and now we have done a follow-up show to the show about injurious behaviors. And so we're just going to wrap up for the day. And our next episode, episode 17, will be about lying. Okay, so we will definitely come back to these topics again, but that's all for now. Thank you for joining us. This show isn't a thing without you. Please find us online. I know I say this every time, but please chime in, write to us. We're listening for how best to serve. We are on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, all at C12Pod. That's C12Pod. We're also on YouTube, where you can find us by searching C12Pod. And I'm finding all kinds of new podcast platforms where our shows are available, things I'd never even heard of before. I can't remember the last one I found, but it did work to search for Citizen 12 and C12Pod. So let us know if you're finding new spots where our show is. It looks to us as though our community could really use this content, and we are excited to create and share it. This is a 100% listener-supported show, so if you already like what you're hearing, or even if you don't, but you think what we're up to is good, please support us by contributing money, subscribing, rating the show, and writing us a review, wherever you listen to podcasts. Thank you to each of you who contribute to this work.
Thank you very much.